Good afternoon. I'm Glen Zorpette. I'm the executive editor of IEEE Spectrum magazine. I'll be the referee, that is to say the moderator of today's session. There are perfectly adequate biographies, brief biographies in the programs you all have, but in case you've missed it, I'll offer a very concise statement. Singularity 2045. Singularity not ever. John Horgan, 5 minutes.
Hi, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank Ray for inviting me here to be the skunk at his garden party, which I think shows an admirable open-mindedness. I've got to confess, though, I used to be a singularity believer even before I heard the term used in that way. So in 1981, I was at Columbia, and I took a course in science writing from Pamela McCordick, a science journalist who at the time was working on a book called Machines Who Think. And it was about this explosion of research within artificial intelligence by Marvin Minsky and John McCarthy. Ed Fredkin was a major character in the book. And all these people were talking about basically the singularity, this coming transformation of humanity brought about by artificial intelligence equaling and then surpassing human intelligence. I thought this was amazing, really exciting. And right around the same period, I actually had a drug trip during which I became the singularity. And but I became this cosmic computer at the end of time. But I have to tell you, it started off as a really good trip, and it ended up as a really bad trip. So be careful what you wish for. So anyway, I became a science writer in 1983. Actually started off at IEEE Spectrum magazine, working on, among other things, writing about artificial intelligence, especially as applied to military applications like Star Wars. Tremendous amounts of money were flowing into artificial intelligence. Again, I thought it was very exciting. I had this vision of science more generally as progressing on all these fronts, and there would be all these amazing intellectual revelations in the future and all these transformations of our lives materially as well. The longer I was a science journalist, I went to Scientific American in 1986 and started writing more about pure fields of science, particle physics and others. And the longer I became a science journalist, the more I decided that science was being presented in a very distorted way by science journalists and scientists. There was this focus not only on the incremental advances science was making, but also on all the things that we were hoping science would do, like artificial intelligence, computers smarter than we were, a unified theory of physics that would reveal the mind of God, as Stephen Hawking put it. I began to notice all the areas of science that weren't progressing exponentially, like the ones that Ray has talked about, but were flat. We weren't making any significant progress at all. I'd just like to give you a few examples of those. One is nuclear fusion. Remember nuclear fusion? 1983, when I was still in journalism school, I went to see the Princeton tokamak, this big, amazing machine with all these wires over it. It was, really big science of a kind that I found really cool. The fusion, and supposedly they were going to produce fusion energy too cheap to meter, well, by now, at least. It never happened. The fusion program has basically collapsed in the United States. It just turned out that fusion is technically too difficult. Another example, in the late 70s, around 1980 even, there were some epidemiologists who were predicting the end of infectious disease. In 1980, that was the official end of smallpox as a threat around the world. Then we had AIDS, then we had all these new forms of flu, we had the resurgence of old diseases like tuberculosis. Nobody's talking about the end of infectious disease anymore. Cancer. Richard Nixon declared war on cancer in 1971. Since then, we've spent about $80 billion of research the budget for the National Cancer Institute has increased tenfold to about $5 billion a year. You probably don't know this because this is something that the cancer industry doesn't like people to know about. Basically, cancer mortality rates have been flat for as long as they have been measured. Now, there was actually a slight increase since 1971 to about 1991, and then a decrease since then up to the present, but that's really just because of an increase and decrease in smoking rates in the United States.
You've got two more in there. You got
2 more minutes? Okay.
Yeah, about 30 seconds. About 30 seconds.
Gene therapy. So Ray has also talked about the Human Genome Project and how rapidly that was finished, in part because of advances in computation. But what do we want out of that? We want treatments for diseases. Gene therapy started in the early 1990s. There have been about 400 clinical trials since then. Gene therapy has been a total bust. As far as I know, the gene therapy scarcely exists anymore because they're trying to regroup and decide how to go forward in the future. One more. How much time do I have again?
3 seconds.
3 seconds. Okay, the last one. This bears on neuroscience. Neuroscience, there are all these measures that make it look like they're proceeding so rapidly, the advances in instrumentation, MRIs, electrodes in the brain, a flood of data coming out. How about an increase in treatments for mental illness? Basically, the way that we treat depression and anxiety and the common mental disorders hasn't progressed since the era of Freud. There was just a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine within the last month that said that psychoanalysis was as effective as cognitive therapy and all the new therapies. You probably know that none of these therapies as a whole, or all of these therapies as a whole, are about as effective as all the drugs, the SSRIs. So against that measure of something that will really benefit humanity, neuroscience, our understanding of the brain remains very primitive. Okay, maybe I'll make some more points later.
Dr. Kurzweil.
Great. Well, there's certainly no shortage of bad predictions, including in the AI field. The exponential growth does not apply to any technology like nuclear fusion. It applies specifically to information technologies. We just updated the charts in my book from 2002 to 2007, and the exponential growth of computation, communication, genetic sequencing, brain scanning technologies, simulations of the brain, and a lot of other things is in fact proceeding quite inexorably. And I'm not just overfitting the past data, but I've been making these forward-looking predictions for a long time. I want to address, I'll come back to the enabling factors for cancer and gene therapy. In fact, we are making good progress in gene therapy, and I'm involved with a project in that area. But I want to talk about the area that's most relevant here, which is brain science, and really address some things you wrote in your IEEE Spectrum article. A few points. I mean, first of all, you're oversimplifying the ideas in the field. You cite my book, and then you put a quote from the field saying, within a decade or so, computers will surpass the computational power of brains, many singularitarians like me say. They base this claim on the assumption that these brain spikes represent the brain's total computational capacity. If the brain contains 1 quadrillion synapses processing on average 10 action potentials per second, then the brain performs 10 quadrillion operations per second. At some point in the near future, singularitarians say computers will surpass that processing rate and leave us in the cognitive dust. And you go on to then say that's a very naive and oversimplified view of how the brain works. I mean, this particular model of how the brain works and how to compute the brain's capacity does exist in some reports about my book and other articles in the field. It bears no relationship to what I or others have actually written. Our models of how much computation is required are based on brain regions that have actually been simulated and tested to correspond to human performance for those specific small regions, and then comparing their neural complexity to the overall brain's capacity, and then also checking that number using several other methodologies which come out with the same result. There's two issues I'd make about the complexity of the brain. You put a picture here of the neocortical column, which you probably can't see, but it's a very complex image. And there's just millions of deeply embedded, complicated connections, and then point out there's millions of these columns in the human brain, and you get an idea of this vast complexity, and you make that point over and over again, that the complexity is vast. Well, it's not my position that the brain is simple, but it's not as complex as it may appear. And in fact, this image is not even a picture of the brain, it's a picture of a simulation of the brain running on an IBM computer, which first of all makes the point that we have in fact simulated it. And
Glenn picked that picture, not me.
It's not my picture.
And the simulation produces these connections the same way the genome produces the connections, by applying some rules that are not simple, of moderate complexity, that we have in fact reverse engineered in this case, and then applying them repetitively with some probabilistic variation. The brain is a probabilistic recursive fractal, which then appears extremely complex. The actual design information is 1 billion times simpler, which is not simple, but a lot simpler than it appears, and that billion is actually a real number, and I derive that in the book. There's only 25 million bytes of design information in the genome that describes the design of the human brain. And I don't have time to go into that derivation, but I mean, there's only 800 million bytes of information in the genome, including the epigenetic information of the machinery that implements it. And it's replete with redundancies. If you apply standard data compression, you get 50 million bytes. Half of that is the human brain. And if I take another example, the cerebellum, that comprises more than half the neurons in the brain. It's responsible for our skill formation, like catching a fly ball. If I handed you, here's the cerebellum, reverse engineer this, you'd say, well, this is hopeless. There's trillions, thousands of trillions of deeply interconnected, convoluted connections. It looks hopeless to reverse engineer that, and you'd put a picture there and say, look at how vast the complexity is. Well, we have reverse engineered it. There's only a few genes that control it, comprising a few tens of thousands of bytes of information, and it describes 4 neurons that are described in a certain pattern, and then it implements this rule recursively 10 billion times, and you get this very complex cerebellum with a lot of stochastic wiring with certain constraints, and then it adapts to the environment as the person learns things. And that has actually been simulated and tested, and you can argue whether simulation is perfect or not, but the fact is it's not as complex as it may appear. And at the other end, the progress is exponential, not only on the data we're getting, but on our ability to model and simulate these processes. And that's a very important difference. A lot of scientists don't factor in this exponential progression. If you take 30 steps linearly, you get to 30. If you take 30 steps exponentially, 248, you get to 1 billion. And it makes a very profound difference. And if I were to approach this problem, even considering the billion-fold simplification you get from considering the massive redundancy in the brain, if I were to think about it in a linear fashion, I would think it's also going to be either never or many centuries away. But it seemed ridiculous when I predicted the internet would become a World Wide Web connecting hundreds of millions of people in the mid-90s, and talked about that in the early 80s when the entire DARPA budget could only tie together a few thousand scientists. But now it doesn't seem so ridiculous. Exponential progress is quite surprising. And there's many examples of artificial intelligence today. Every time you send a cell phone call, get an electrocardiogram, controlling just-in-time inventory levels. I could mention 100 different applications, and we are making dramatic progress in software. Language technologies are improving. Google created an English to Arabic and Arabic to English translator that compared well to human translators, but not only that, the translator was written by an AI program because nobody on the team spoke a word of Arabic. So they had these matched Rosetta Stone texts, and using pattern recognition techniques, an AI program created a translator that then compared well to humans. And in terms of cancer, first of all, we have made progress in some areas. Heart disease is way down. Infectious diseases are, in fact, down. Gene therapy is starting to work. We have a project where we take lung cells out of the body, edit gene in vitro, expect it got done correctly, replicated 1 million-fold. It's another new technology. Inject it back in the body, it goes through the bloodstream, it ends up back in the lungs, and is cured a fatal disease. There are new techniques of gene therapy that are beginning to work. In terms of cancer, it's a genetic disease. And so you need certain enabling factors like the genome and like the ability to actually make modifications to the genome. So RNA interference, which can turn genes off, has just begun to work in the last few years. New forms of gene therapy are starting to work. We can now simulate these processes on computers. We've discovered stem cells, cancer stem cells, and actually can identify them and have identified weaknesses in their reproductive mechanism that are different than eukaryotic cells. And I believe we will make substantial progress in cancer, but you need the enabling factors. Things are not exponential until they become an information technology. Health and medicine has just become an information technology. We just collected the genome in 2003. We have RNA interference and these other things and ability to simulate biology that are now information processes. And that's all at an early stage, but it will expand exponentially.
Okay, I think I'm going to ask each of you a question now, and then I'm going to ask each of you to ask each other a question. Okay, Dr. Kurzweil, you've just now mentioned, and you've made a convincing case in your book, that of the fact that 30 million to 100 million bytes of genome data encode the brain. But my question is, what good is that compactness of encoding unless you intend to somehow use a genome to make a brain?
Actually, I don't think that gives us some information. In fact, we have linked the genes that control cerebellum wiring to the wiring pattern, and it does give us some hints. But there's other ways to get the information. Brain science is proceeding on lots of different fronts, from detailed simulations of individual neurons to developing functional simulations of whole regions, like a dozen regions of the auditory cortex, regions of the visual cortex, the cerebellum. There's about 20 different regions that have been modeled and simulated. The spatial resolution of brain scanning is doubling every year. The amount of data we're getting is doubling every year. And we're showing we can turn this data into working models and simulations. The argument from the genome is just to point out that the design, there's only so much information in that design. The genome does not, as we know, translate simply into function. It's not one gene per disease or one gene per neuron or anything like that. But the amount of design information is only about 25, maybe 50 million bytes, which is less than an MP3 file, which is not simple, but it does magnify itself when it actually expands into a brain. You've seen pictures of the Mandelbrot set, which look vastly complex, and there are images, videos on the web where you can surf into the Mandelbrot set, and it looks like vast complexity. And it's on the cover of a book called Complexity. The formula for it is only 6 bytes long, and it's repeated iteratively. Now, the brain is not that simple. It's more like 25, 30 million bytes. That's not simple, but it's a level of complexity we can handle. And yes, there's a lot about the brain we don't know. John says we don't even understand how irony works. Well, I think if we understood how the brain does irony, we would have finished the project. These are the kind of last things that we will do. But we are making progress. And yes, I agree, it would seem daunting if our progress were to be linear, but this is definitely an information technology.
I'd just like to make a point before you ask me my question about genetic complexity or simplicity. I read a book recently that I would highly recommend to people here called Microcosm by one of the best science writers in the country, Carl Zimmer. And it's everything you could possibly want to know about E. coli, the bacteria that are in everybody here, in your guts. And so E. coli have been used to understand how genes work, how they create proteins and so forth. And they've also become an engine of biotechnology. So they're a real lab workhorse. An enormous amount is known about E. coli, but there's this fascinating phenomenon in the study of E. coli that I think reflects something happening in biology at large, where the more they study this little tiny bacterium, the more mysterious it becomes. So, for example, you hear even that once we know the human genome for individuals, that will help us know a lot about our personality traits and behavior and so forth, especially in the 1990s, behavioral genetics was pretending that it would know everything possible about us just through our specific genes. Well, it turns out that knowing the genes of an E. coli won't tell you everything you need to know about it. You put identical clones of one E. coli in an identical environment, a broth or so forth, they will act in different ways. Some will just sit there lazily, others will swim energetically around. You put them in a toxic environment, they react in different ways to that. And there are mechanisms at work there that can't be reduced to genetics, and this doesn't even have a nucleus, this cell. So I think...
Well, the genome of the E. coli is actually not so simple. It turns out fairly simple. What we think of as simple animals are, in fact, genetically quite complex. But the collection of the genome was exponential, and we're now at the early stages. It's only a few years ago that we finished collecting it, and now we need to reverse engineer it, and we do realize that genes work in elaborate networks. They interact by creating three-dimensional proteins that interact in complex ways, and it's in fact not the most direct way to reverse engineer the brain. And we're in the early stages of reverse engineering both the brain and the genome, understanding how the genome actually translates itself into organisms. But that will proceed and is proceeding exponentially, understanding how the genes create proteins, how the so-called junk DNA, which is not junk, actually controls gene expression. And all these things are expanding in an exponential manner, and you can show that. But we're in an early stage, and it's easy to sort of express skepticism, as was expressed about the Genome Project itself, when you're in an early stage. Halfway through the Genome Project, people dismissed it as a failure because we had only finished 1% of the genome, but it continued to double every year and stayed on schedule.
Let me just try to clarify one point. I think, actually, as a result of reading Carl's book, I became much more optimistic that there will be, as opposed to what I said in my book, The End of Science, in 1996, that there could really be some profound revelations coming from biology as we get deeper into this complexity. I think we've gone through this very simplistic reductionist stage in science over the last few decades, especially when it comes to, well, actually biology and physics. And now, the sense I got is, reading this book, is that there is great excitement on the part of scientists that they are, even the genetic code they realize is much more complicated in how it works in organisms than anybody had realized even a decade ago. I think the consequences intellectually will be very exciting. But what it means in terms of some of the things that we've talked about here at this meeting, engineering humans or creating computers that mimic the complexity of the human brain, I think some of those goals are being pushed. I think this science pushes those goals very far into the future.
Okay, on that note, you've expressed even disdain about continuing the singularity research or the amount of attention given other world problems. However, as I'm sure you'd agree, countless breakthroughs in technology came by researchers looking for something else entirely. Just earlier this year, R. Stanley Williams and colleagues at Hewlett-Packard discovered the long-awaited memristor while looking for something else originally. They had gone off on some nanotech device thing, and by the end, they had found the memristor. So even if you disagree that a singularity is imminent or even possible, can't something marvelous and unexpected arise from this pursuit?
Yeah, I guess it depends on whether you need all the rhetorical packaging for that to happen. It seems to me that a lot of people here, Cynthia, as an example, I don't think, at least the sense I got is that she's not necessarily a believer in the singularity, but she's doing very interesting work in artificial intelligence. Obviously the guy from Intel, I mean, that's real science. It's going to make our cell phones and so forth cooler in the future. I worry about the rhetoric because this is a time when science is under attack from many quarters. Even though I'm a critic of science, I'm a critic of science because I love it and I can't stand scientific hype and I can't stand seeing things said in the name of science that I don't think are truly merited by what's being done in science. And I have written, and I'll say it here, I think that the rhetoric of the singularity is more appropriate to a religious movement than it is to science per se. And that, I've also said this about superstring theorists, by the way, and I think that that damages the credibility of science as a whole at a time when, that's not good for science.
Okay, let's try to...
Well, just to comment on that, I will say that how we make progress is in fact through, not with one grand leap with, a singularity project or even a brain reverse engineering project, or we're going to create a human level intelligence, but through lots of incremental progress. Many people who don't, in fact, even think about what the long-term implications are or where we're going or how this fits into the scheme of things. But it's lots of little steps that get us from here to there. And the two important points, I think, that where we differ is, first of all, on the complexity of the brain, because you make that point over and over again, is to try to illustrate just how vastly complex it is, as if every single connection here were, here by design. And my point there is we are capable of reverse engineering it. Our intelligence is not below the threshold needed. We're showing that as we get data on specific regions, we can actually understand them, model them, simulate them, test those simulations, and the scale of that and the number of regions being simulated is scaling up in an exponential manner. And that's the other point, which is to look at the progress exponentially, because if you look at it linearly, and I think that's our intuition. I think that's hardwired in our brains. When we walked through the savannah 1,000 years ago, we would make linear predictions about where that predator was going to be in 20 seconds, and they worked quite fine. It's not our intuition to think of exponential progress. And if you really factor in the exponential nature of progress in information technology, not non-information technology, not biology before it became an information technology, then you have a very different perspective. I would share your perspective if, in fact, progress were linear in these fields.
Okay, why don't you ask each other a question, and then we'll probably have time, if we can get through this in the next 5 minutes, to take questions from the audience. So who wants to go first?
Let me see, what would be a question that can really put you on the spot more than I already have? Let me try to ask, it's sort of a technical question. We've been going back and forth about the complexity of the brain, and I find this fascinating. I've been writing a lot about neuroscience recently, and about something called the neural code, for example, which is a name that some neuroscientists use to describe the software that runs on the brain. So the question is, what is the neural code? And scientists used to have a very simplistic view of it as being a simple rate code. So it's the rate of these electrical pulses transmitted across synapses that encodes information. But as you probably know, Ray, now that paradigm is toppling or maybe even lying in pieces on the ground. There are all these new codes that are being proposed, timing codes, population codes. But then there's the added problem that it appears that the brain keeps inventing new codes all the time in response to new stimuli. So this is why the artificial cochlea works so well. The artificial cochlea is a very primitive device, but the brain basically figures out a way to use this information by creating a new coding mechanism. And
is there a question?
In a way, no, there's not. It's just a lecture. In a way, it's a very exciting insight, but I would think, is it possible that computers, that artificial intelligence can capture this aspect of the brain software that is really dynamic, constantly changing, constantly reinventing itself?
Well, first of all, it's a little bit like asking what are the chemicals that affect the performance of organs in the human body? Well, there's more than one organ. The answer to that with the pancreatic islet cells is different than the stomach or the large intestine. The brain is not one organ. It's a whole set of information processing organs. There's over 100 different regions. And we understand the answer to that question with some regions. There's a certain code for certain regions of the auditory cortex that is just temporal and not sequential. It's pretty clear that the cerebral cortex, the code of transmitting from one area of that region to another does involve a temporal component. And there are early simulations of that region that have a code that does perform well in tests on comparing it to human performance. That's at an early stage. The cerebellum has a code that does involve temporal and timing information. That's actually been pretty well established and tested in several different ways, and appears to work well. And all of these can be done by computers. I mean, computers clearly can do temporal and spatial codes and much more complex coding than has been, in fact, proposed for different regions of the brain. But we are making progress on this, and different regions have different functions. Once we understand those functions, we can then amplify them. That's what engineering does well. Bernoulli's principle is a subtle principle about air pressure, but by amplifying it, engineering created the whole world of aviation. So as we understand these subtle principles about how the brain produces parallel algorithms to perform intelligent behavior, we can re-engineer them to be far more powerful. So we're making progress on the coding along with a lot of other aspects of a brain function, but it's in an early stage. And it's easy to point out things that we don't know yet. Just like, halfway through the Genome project, we were only 1% there.
Do you have a question for John?
Well, you sort of don't differentiate between information technologies like brain science and reverse engineering the brain and artificial intelligence and non-information technologies like nuclear fusion. So what was your view of, let's say, the internet in the 1980s when it was at a very early stage and easy to scoff at it ever being a worldwide web, which some people were talking about, but it was scoffed at by skeptics because it was at an early stage?
Technology has transformed my life. The internet, I really have always tried to avoid when the internet was emerging, I tried to avoid writing about it because it seemed like a kind of hardcore, nerdy computer technology. And after I left Spectrum, I wanted to write about pure science, particle physics, and cosmology. But as soon as I realized it could help me in my job, then I was very excited about it. So I am stunned at the advances of information technology that have taken place. When Glen and I started working together at Spectrum in 1983, we worked on IBM Selectric typewriters. I mean, some of you probably don't even know what those are. Actually, I just wanted, before we're almost over, I just wanted to bring up what I think is sort of a guiding principle of artificial intelligence that I believe just might be wrong, and I think maybe it was too early to say it was wrong 20 years ago, but maybe now is the time to acknowledge that it might be wrong, or at least partially wrong in a way that's really important, and that has to do with whether substrate matters. I think, so artificial intelligence has always assumed that you could extract the code, the software from a brain and transfer it into silicon, and maybe that's not possible. Maybe the software of the brain is uniquely adapted to the stuff of the brain.
Well,
anyway, I think that's actually a question.
Well, in your article, I think you make some good points about the nature of consciousness, which is quite different from intelligence. And I think the key to the singularity is, in fact, amplifying intelligence, ultimately many-fold. And consciousness is a complex philosophical issue. I talk about that in the book. It's actually not something that we can measure in a straightforward way with objective science. There's an intellectual gap between consciousness, which is subjectivity, and science, which is objectivity.
Can the singularity happen without consciousness? Artificial consciousness?
Well, I think it can amplify our intelligence. I mean, that's really what the singularity is all about. The Turing test is not a test of consciousness. It's a test of performance. It's a performance test. And we can't absolutely, prove that someone else is conscious. We make that assumption, or we'd all go crazy. But and my prediction is that an entity that passes the Turing test, therefore has the emotional intelligence that Cynthia talked about, will convince us that it's conscious. But that's not an absolute philosophical demonstration that it is. My own view is that consciousness is not substrate dependent. As we add more and more, non-biological aspects to our brain, we're going to remain conscious entities, even when the bulk of the action in our brains is non-biological. But that's a philosophical position, not a scientific position, and I think you're correct on that, John. But when it comes to actually understanding human performance, which is really all we can say about another human, the brain is subject to physical laws. We can understand how it works. It design information, no matter how you talk about the complexity of translating the genome into the brain, is only on the order of 25 million bytes. We are making exponential gains in understanding that, and we will reconstitute it, and we're going to do that in many incremental steps, but the tools to do that will get more and more powerful. And that's what's leading to the singularity. It's an intelligence explosion.
Okay, where's the angel of death? Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, I think we have 5 minutes.
Questions?
Over here, I guess
Yeah,
I talked
okay.
since I got my hand up. If I was to stereotype both your positions, I'd say John was going to say if he had one word, it would be complexity, complexity, complexity. And if Ray had one word, it would be exponential, exponential, exponential. And let's say we take those mass simplifications to their extreme, face them off against each other. Unless you don't believe that the exponential trend is what's actually going on, which is, I guess, an empirical debate, then isn't it just a question of a little bit more time for exponential to beat complexity anyways? And how does John feel about that? I know how Ray feels about it.
Well, what I've tried to point out.
I'll repeat the questions. John's position is heavily revolves around the complexity of the brain. Ray's is about the exponential pace of progress in many technologies, including information technologies. So the question is
but also that the brain is not as complex as it appears. I mean, not every
Right.
connection here has
to be explicit.
Yeah.
So the question is that if you apply exponential progress against an arbitrarily difficult, complex problem, doesn't the exponential progress eventually win?
What I tried to show just with the examples I gave in the beginning is that there are certain problems that seem to be extraordinarily resistant. And, we've had very powerful computer technology for decades now and getting more powerful all the time. And you haven't seen, along with extraordinary breakthroughs in sort of basic understanding of physics and biology, and you would think that would have led to some of these breakthroughs in the treatment of cancer or mental illness or fusion that I've talked about. There are tremendous financial incentives for those sorts of advances. And I just feel it's really important when you're talking about these exponential curves and this fantastic progress in certain areas to point out all the other areas that are very important to us where it is just, if I was seeing some progress, I might say, yeah, maybe the exponential curve will, wipe out the complexity eventually. But I'm not seeing any signs of that at all at this point.
Okay, we have one.
It occurs to me, maybe the singularity won't happen in one of these human-centric, brain-like ways. Maybe the singularity will happen in the cloud.
Okay, the question is maybe the singularity will happen in the cloud rather than in some discrete computer.
Well, I think the cloud is an example of the exponential growth of the computation we have available. Right now, 99% of the computes that we have in the world are sitting there waiting for the next keystroke. And in fact, we are going to organize them in a more effective manner. But to address what you just said, when a technology is pre-information error, as energy has been, and I'm going to talk about that later because now we're approaching an era where information technology will influence energy, it's not subject to exponential growth. It's linear growth or maybe no growth. Health and medicine has not been an information technology up until just recently. Now it is. That's in an early stage, and we're going to see tremendous progress. But we do see some progress. Heart disease is way down. Infectious diseases are in fact down, and cancer, now we have the enabling factors, including the genome and stem cells, to make progress, and there's some actually very encouraging projects in that area.
Okay, we have time for one more question. We have to make it fast and potentially embarrassing. Back there, over there, you sir. Yes?
It seems to me to be the case that if you could reduce the brain to information technology, that Ray wins, and if you can, then you win.
I can't disagree with that. The statement was that if you can reduce the brain to information technology, Ray wins, and if you can't, John wins.
That's just sort of
We can't decide right now,
That's
so
just
we're going to have to call it a draw.
Yeah, it's a restatement of the debate, but.
Okay, thank you all.